Well, working in America or working for Americans for many, many years often profoundly changes us in many, many ways, good and bad. And in many cases, as returnees, we often don't realize how different we can be when we come back home after decades and decades away from home, after decades working for an American. So today, I want to talk with you about some habits in life that we pick up when we work with Americans or when we work in America. I will be highlighting the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this might be important for folks who are thinking about moving back home because often we don't consciously think about some of these issues, and it ends up creating conflict with people who we end up working with back at home. So as I talk about this issue, I want to show you some of the prep work that we are doing in our little farm. We are extending the vegetable garden. As I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, that the demand for sekoma, which is kales in the village, far outstrips the supply. So we are doing our best to try to extend our ability to supply the village with vegetables, but we don't have the capacity to do so yet. So that's a good problem to have. So welcome back to Karateng. For those who are watching us for the first time, we are filming from Karateng, which is a village in the middle of Kisumu, a town in Western Kenya. It's a place we love. It's a place where, as I've said before, many of my most recent ancestors lay here. So I'm very passionate about everything village and everything Karateng. So welcome back again to our channel. If you have not subscribed, please watch till the end. And if you find this content interesting enough, I hope you will subscribe. But even if you don't subscribe today, I'm just glad that you are going to spend some time with us. So let me provide some context, because as you watch the video, you will notice a few things that may look a little off. For a Kenyan who grew up in the village, most of what you'll see is nothing unusual. But for folks who are foreign to villages, you'll see some things that are a little off. So I'm going to have to give you some context here. So for one, you'll notice that there's very little mechanization going on. As you can see, my mom is literally watering every single hole using a hose, and we are doing the same thing the entire farm. So very little mechanization. Of course, there's some amount of irrigation. In this place, I think we are probably the only ones doing irrigation here. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we are the only ones that have sekoma. And then one of the things you'll notice, in general, it feels as if we do things the hard way. Of course, with minimal safety taken into account. And here's why that happens. Number one, a lot of us tend to have relatively smaller farms. So as you can tell, this farm runs from here until just a few yards behind where my mom currently standing. So most of us don't have massive farms that require a lot of mechanization. And then the cost of labor in the village is very affordable. So even if your farm is not mechanized, many of us can afford to hire lots of people to do the same job. And again, many of farmers in the village may have minimal exposure to other ways of doing the same things in more efficient ways. So it takes a little while for folks to change, because some of us are just not that well informed. Because personally, all I've known about farming is just subsistence farming. It's just now that I'm visiting farms and learning from folks. So that explains part of what you see right now. And then we try to minimize our costs. And one way of minimizing costs is just using local labor. Having to buy a tractor or even a plane and all that stuff, I mean, those things can be really expensive. And so this is one way we keep our costs low. And then, of course, in doing so, one of the benefits that comes with the way we do things in the village is that you end up creating employment for a lot of people. Because typically for us on a daily basis, we have no less than 5 people, sometimes up to 10, 15 people helping us around. And these are families that depend on the kind of work that we offer. So while financially, again, sometimes it may make little sense for those who are looking to cut costs from hiring fewer folks, But what we're doing has a benefit of just ensuring that many families are fed because folks work and earn on a daily basis. Most of folks who work with us daily wage earners. We have a few permanent employees here and there. So it helps. So if you see something that looks unusual or looks inefficient, I know folks are going to come at me in the comment section. Don't worry about it. There's a reason we do things the way we are. However, for this irrigation system, I'm actually getting a quote right now to develop a drip irrigation system because I also find this wildly inefficient and maybe too labor intensive. So anyway, so let me start by sharing a few things about general Kenyan work ethic, so that when we compare the Kenyan work ethic versus the American work ethic, then you may be able to see the gaps and why some of us actually struggle when we get to America or struggle when we are coming back to Kenya after many years. So what I'm going to describe really is a very specific part of Kenyan employment experience. There's going to be lots of variations, and so this does not explain everything you need to know about working in Kenya. So some of what I describe actually will also be true both in Kenya and in diaspora. So I'm just talking about maybe the average Kenyan worker typically employed somewhere. So in many cases, it's very customary for Kenyans to have lots of reverence to their bosses, where whatever the boss says goes, and people almost literally worship their bosses, again, depending on where you work. And that system comes with a top-down approach where the boss says something and everybody applies it, no question to it. And I see a similar thing in many Asian countries as well. And so when we move from Kenya and come to the US, and then like in my case where my boss was asking, hey, what do you think? That question was really difficult for me because I was used to being told what to do, and not that the boss would need my opinion. So in some workplaces in America, bosses actually ask and consult. It doesn't happen everywhere, but there are few places in America where that happens. And then we tend to be fairly formal, especially for those of us who do white-collar jobs. I remember as an educator in Kenya, I would put on formal clothes, suits and ties, virtually 6 days a week. In the last 20 years, I've only probably put on a suit maybe twice or thrice. And one was my own wedding. The next one, I think I was in the lineup for a cousin's wedding. But yes, in Kenya, we tend to be very formal in the way we dress, very formal in the way we use titles. Like, you don't just call people by their first names. It's a Mr. somebody, Dr. somebody. We're very formal in that sense. And we can be flexible with time. You all know what that means. But yes, it's not unusual for folks to be flexible with time. And often we are relatively less competitive compared to Americans. And then there are fewer protections for women and minorities, at least on the ground. On paper, there may be protections, but in real life, there are far fewer protections. And that sometimes can mean that men especially can be too comfortable around women in terms of the comments people make or the actions people engage in. So it's not unusual for men to engage in behaviors that to me would qualify as sexual assault. And in response, folks would simply treat things like that as normal. And that's one thing that has gotten quite a few Kenyans in trouble in the US, where certain behaviors that were accepted in work setting in Kenya are no longer acceptable in the US, but because we have not made that switch, when we do those things here, we end up getting in trouble. I know quite a few Kenyans who've really gotten in trouble with sexual assault in that manner. And then, of course, it's very typical for men especially to leave work and then hang out as a group, maybe go to a bar, and then get back home late. In many workplaces, you tend to find very homogeneous groups, especially in terms of race, religion, and ethnicity, as opposed to many US settings where that may be different. And then, of course, we are often less sensitive to issues of diversity, especially when you talk about gender, you talk about race, and things like that. Swahili is very present in many work settings. And in fact, in a typical Kenyan setting, when we are all Kenyans, we speak multiple languages all at the same time. And that's nothing really unusual. So how is this different from my experience in America? Number one, Americans can be fairly informal, both in terms of dress codes or even the use of titles. I really had a hard time when I first moved to the US, and my professor at the time, I think it was probably in the 70s, insisted that I would call him by his first name. It's like, just call me John. I could not do it. I just couldn't because I was so used to just using titles, especially for folks who are older than me. So Americans are generally informal. In fact, the way you see me dressed right now, pouring water, I'm basically in sandals, shorts, and a shirt. That is how sometimes I go to class. Some of you may already know that I'm a professor at a college. Especially in the summer or winter, I would simply put on my sandals, grab my computer in my shorts, and I just go teach. Something I would never do in Kenya. So yes, Americans can be very informal in that respect. And then there's this myth of meritocracy, that you earn things or you earn your place in a workspace. They talk about it. I think it's still a myth. Of course, Americans can be very competitive in ways that are good, but in other ways, this level of competitiveness can be quite counterproductive. In workplaces like mine, especially in the education profession, we are often very sensitive to issues of diversity. And so there are many things put in place to hire folks that come from underserved communities. Whether you're talking about black people, you're talking about women, folks who identify as LGBTQ, and things like that. It's not unusual to do that. And again, this also depends on where you live. If you live in some of these conservative states, those folks are doing other things. Now, what many people may not realize, especially folks who've never been to America, that while English is the primary language being used, there's a very specific version of English that is preferred in America. There's lots of variations of it, but sometimes we call it white people English, and not all white people. The English that is spoken in the southeastern part of the US is not often considered as quote unquote high end. And so, yes, English is the preferred language, but there are versions of it that are more preferred than others. But even so, it's not unusual to find materials that are presented in other languages like Chinese, Spanish, and all that, depending on where you live. And then, of course, it's not typical for folks to make friends at work. But for Kenyans who've lived in the US for a while, we don't see workplace as a place to go make friends. I don't go to work to make friends. I go to work, do what I need to do, and then leave. Now, it's possible folks can make friends, and I've made some really good friends at work, but that's not what I do for a variety of reasons. Now, besides that, I was also taken aback when I first moved to work, and then within a few minutes, I would hear my colleagues share some of the most personal things about their families, their children, their husbands, and all that in ways that I didn't see in Kenya. So I just found it shocking that Americans would do that, at least in my work setting. And in America, if you cannot self-advocate, you're doomed. If you cannot stand up for yourself, you're going to be in trouble. So you have to learn to self-advocate. Funnily enough, even with all the protections, there's quite a bit of bullying within workplaces. And I've seen terrible instances of bullying, especially amongst nurses in the US. Some nurses that come from a country that I will not mention have been accused a lot of that. But bullying does happen, especially senior nurses bullying junior nurses who are just starting to work. Then, of course, the issue of clocking in, where there's less flexibility with time, is not a surprise around work. Sometimes lunches are timed. I hear people going for like 15-minute lunch break, 10-minute lunch break, things that I never saw when I was in Kenya. And then in my type of work, there's something we call let's meet for lunch, where you arrange a meeting around lunchtime where you're eating and working at the same time. A very strange culture. In my typical Kenyan setting, if it's lunch, we sit down, eat lunch. When we're done, we go to work. But with the kind of work that I do, a lot of things we do over lunch, something I find extremely strange that I've not gotten used to almost 2 decades later. And then Americans don't use their vacations in ways that we do in Kenya. Many of my folks would rather work than take vacation, or they would rather be paid their vacation hours to stay at work, something that we find really unusual. So why does this matter? Number one, it matters because a lot of us are very different when we come back home in ways that we don't realize. And so I hope you keep this in mind as we learn to readjust back home. Because in many cases, we get frustrated when people at home do things in ways that don't match our new way of doing things. So it's helpful for folks to be a lot more patient, learn to adjust, and also bring some of the good things that you have picked up working in America, while at the same time really being patient and understanding that culturally we are different. And so don't try to recreate America in the village. I hope this was useful, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and I'll see you in the next. Thank you.